Hello, and welcome to the second dance talk this year. Today I'm happy to have Dragan Gašević as our guest. Dragan is a professor and chair in learning analytics and informatics at the University of Edinburgh, and he's been involved in dance from the very beginning. Today he's going to talk about ProSolo, a platform for personalized competency-based learning. If you're watching this live, feel free to submit questions and comments through the Q&A tool of the Hangout, and we're going to address these questions after the presentation. Now, without further ado, I'm handing over to Dragan. Happy to have you here today.
Thanks very much, Oliver, and my pleasure to be today and to talk to the dance group and the audience. So I am quite excited actually to talk about ProSolo and the work that we've done so far on the platform for, we call it personalize and competency-based learning. And I'm going to quickly introduce what we mean by that. Before I even start, I want to acknowledge a few people who've been involved into the development of ProSolo since early days. So the two specific individuals, Zoran Jeremic and Nikola Milikic, they invested years of long nights and days developing the platform, and also two other individuals who've been really great colleagues and collaborators and helped us to arrive to this point. Those are George Siemens and Shane Dodson, who've been also involved into the development of ProSolo. Without really explaining much about ProSolo, I'm going to just cut to the chase and describe the reasons why we decided to develop ProSolo. One of the critical things before even understanding and discussing why ProSolo, it's really critical to interrogate what is the current educational landscape and what we are currently dealing with. And the reality is that most of even so-called conventional, traditional institutions on campuses have more and more so-called non-traditional students. Those are typically students who have at least part-time jobs, typically even full-time jobs, and quite frequently their dependents. The other critical thing is in many universities, given the increased needs for education, we are experiencing large classrooms, and therefore personalization of any learning experience is quite hard when you have a big lecture hall with hundreds of students in them. Another critical thing is that some students, due to their different approach and the different lifestyle that they have, it takes much longer to complete their degrees. And then quite frequently also universities, due to their limited capacities on their campuses, they have a very long waiting list for students to enroll into the courses that are really essential for them to complete some of their degrees. The other critical thing, and the not really big discovery, but something that I call more as a confirmation, that's the MOOC phenomena. In terms of basically MOOCs, we can really state at this stage that they just confirm the need that they are people with different backgrounds that require different models and approaches to their education, in addition to the conventional educational means that we've been typically experiencing inside of the universities. So that basically is nicely described through different demographics that are shown that typical MOOC completers are those who are already having some higher ed education, and also that are having different types of degrees. Therefore, then basically we can really acknowledge two critical things. That learning happens not only in schools, but somewhere else, somewhere that is not necessarily that formal, and that we today have a very diversified ecosystem of the offering. And the other thing is that learning doesn't end with graduation of students. That is to say, learners need to basically have lifelong learning needs and need to be supported in that entire process. So from that perspective, we basically then can go and we can see different types of trends that are emerging in this process. One of these trends is that we need to depart from credit hours and the current performance focus. One of these things is that we need to acknowledge is a critical basically focus on something that are disciplines that are trying to also promote more mastery learning through competency focus. So that basically is happening in the process of involving many different types of stakeholders. One of these groups is obviously the US government and the Department of Education that also promoted a need for competency-based learning and personalized learning, where learners' experience is not really measured by the number of hours they spent in university, but rather basically by the fact of their mastery, and regardless of the location where or the environment where that basically acquisition of a particular skill happened. The other critical thing is from the perspective of personalized learning. Conventionally, computer scientists think that personalized learning is if you just adapt content, and not only just computer scientists, but there are many individuals who are thinking that personalized learning is also just to adapt bits and pieces of the existing curricula and then just offer different types of sequences to learners with different types of needs, different types of progression level, and so on. What we actually take with personalized learning inside of ProSolo is something different. We actually are thinking from the perspective where learners are driving their learning, that learners are connecting their learning with their interests, passions, and aspirations, and in particular, long-term goals, that learners are participating in the design of their learning, and they are also the owners of the responsibility in terms of what they need to learn and how to learn. And the other critical thing is that they are those who are setting their goals, what to learn next. The other critical thing is, of course, given that learners are in that process, then they are also in the need to build their networks of peers and experts and instructors or mentors who are helping them in that process. But at the same time, the focus is primarily on mastery of some content and basically development of certain set of competencies. One critical thing for learners in this process is that they need to be much more self-directed in a way how they are selecting and setting some of their goals, how they are planning their learning, and how they are going towards some of their final competencies. And then the critical thing in that process is, of course, assessment. And in this process, assessment is for learning, not of learning necessarily, but rather that basically learners need to get support about their learning. So this is just a general picture that we are talking about. And now we are going to discuss a bit about design principles that we picked on when we were actually looking into this existing landscape and how we decide to design ProSolo. Obviously, one of the critical things that is mentioned in my previous discussion was the importance of self-directed learning. And when we are talking about self-directed learning, of course, it's critical to be developed. However, we are also aware that not many learners really are effective self-directed learners. And therefore, for that process, it is really critical to have different types of instructional, social, and technological scaffolds, some of them that are embedded inside of ProSolo. The other critical thing for understanding of self-directed learning is that learners are constructing knowledge and that learners are agents. When we are saying that learners are constructing knowledge, we really mean that learners are using different types of tools. And when we are talking about tools, those are not just digital tools and different types of platforms, but those could be also different types of cognitive or even physical, like writing and taking notes. And the critical thing about this knowledge construction is that with these tools, we are using them to perform operation on different raw information. And then based on that, we generate products of our learning. So products of our learning is, in this particular case, for example, mastery, that we can do a particular activity, or that can be also something which is related to higher order learning and higher order competencies. From the other angle, the agency is really critical, because whenever learners are creating their products or choosing which operations to perform on a raw operation, they are always using different standards to assess the quality of their products and also the effectiveness of their learning strategy. And in that process, if learners are coming with lower prior knowledge or with incorrect standards in terms of the expectations, for example, how long certain activity may take, then their decisions and their agency will be driven in a direction which is not necessarily optimal for their own learning. The other critical thing for ProSolo was also that it had to facilitate especially process and formative feedback. And that process, that feedback is primarily driven through the social interactions that are coming by basically partnering with different types of peers, but at the same time also through the assessment pipeline that is promoting lots of formative feedback and basically opportunities that are guiding students how to improve on their existing learning. Another critical thing, which is quite distinct for ProSolo, is that competency is a social object. Learners basically can share their activities that are associated in ProSolo. They can team up and work towards those competencies together. They can also discover or create new resources that are helping in their process of learning when they are working towards acquiring a particular competency. And in that process, they can also help each other by monitoring and by offering something which is recently called socially shared regulated learning. The other important thing is that to recognize that learners may have different pathways, and these pathways are unique for every learner, and therefore even their profiles are also different. Therefore, if learners are coming with different backgrounds and already have certain prior knowledge that is relevant for acquisition of particular competencies, then we should not be expecting from them to go through the same pathway as anybody else to demonstrate that they had a particular competency, but rather they can compile their portfolios and show what they have in their profiles before they can actually ask for assessment and credentialing of potential competencies. The other important thing also that ProSolo acknowledges is that learning doesn't happen in a silo. When we say silo, is that learning doesn't happen in a single platform. There is a specific, for example, learning management system or a MOOC platform or so on. It happens in all these different platforms, and it also happens in different social media. Therefore, this is one of the critical things that ProSolo aims to achieve, is to aggregate resources that learners are using, creating, and providing to each other, and then based on that aggregation, allow them to establish and show their personal profiles. And the final critical thing is, while we may offer some of these informal and self-directed learning opportunities, at the same time, for credibility of that learning, we need to have something which allows for the process of credentialing. And in that process, learners need to show that they had evidence to basically to show evidence that they mastered particular types of competencies that they are aiming to achieve. So this is another critical thing that ProSolo has. Another critical thing that typically hasn't been really well supported in technologies, and that ProSolo also aim to do, is basically to allow institutions to learn from the experience of the individual learners through the accumulation of different resources, different types of pathways, and then by sharing those with different types of stakeholders that are involved into the educational processes inside of institutions or even outside of institutions. In that way, the overall organizational knowledge base is also continuously growing, unlike existing solutions that are typically just recognizing there is a fixed content provided by the institution, and that content typically is provided by the set of experts. So this slide demonstrates the overall conceptual model that demonstrates how ProSolo learners are going through this process. So we recognize that learners at the self-directed level go through three major phases, and those are planning of their learning, execution of their learning, and then presentation of that learning, which typically assumes also assessment and also reflection of what they've achieved. All these phases of learning are completely surrounded by socialization opportunities that they can actually get involved with other individuals. And then, of course, critical component is credentialing, that is allowing for learners to submit some of their achievements and some of their competencies together with their social profiles for credentialing, and then get recognition from different types of bodies, whether basically we are talking about institutional recognition, or it could be also from their peers, or different types of models that ProSolo can potentially be used. On the, of course, edge of ProSolo then has plenty of different APIs and integrations with tools that are typically used or found on the web, also integration with different types of MOOC platforms, also opportunities to use open educational resources, or even integration with formal learning or platforms that are used typically in formal or workplace learning. From the perspective of technologies, what ProSolo builds on is it builds on existing technologies, primarily uses, for example, LTI to integrate all these different educational technologies, but at the same time also to offer ProSolo as a provider to be used in other technologies. The other critical thing is the use of social media, and ProSolo by itself and by its own nature is social media. Also, ProSolo is very driven by different types of analytics that are implemented in it, and also more and more is using machine learning. By its own nature and by offering plenty of different recommender systems, ProSolo builds on the different types of recommender system techniques, both content and collaborative filtering ones, but also on different techniques for information retrieval. I'm going to now quickly go through ProSolo and to demonstrate some of its major functionalities. I'm not going to do live demo. Live demo can be basically done by you who are watching this video. You simply need to go to dlamooc.prosolo.ca, and if you have edX credentials for accessing edX courses, you can also log into ProSolo and then explore ProSolo yourself. I'm going to now quickly go and explain how ProSolo is implemented and what are some of the critical functionalities inside of ProSolo. From the perspective of ProSolo and its design, and the approach that we are using in the development of ProSolo, it's purely driven by design-based research. And that really means that we have several iterations, and in each iteration we have different interventions. And each of these interventions then basically is assessed the extent to which it can influence different types of self-directed learning processes and other types of processes that are relevant to determine the effectiveness of ProSolo. The other critical thing that ProSolo builds on is the European project, which was called Intelio, which ended in 2012, and in which we actually charted some initial ideas that eventually led into the development of ProSolo. We had a very early prototype at that time. It wasn't even called ProSolo, it was called LearnBee. And at that point, we basically identified 7 different types of interventions that can support self-regulated and self-directed learning in informal learning environments. What we actually found is that something which we called at the time social wave was by far the most central and most important intervention that would be influencing any other type of activity that learners had inside of ProSolo. Social wave, it really was just a simple activity stream that is commonly available in many social media, such as Twitter or Facebook. But of course, we also identify a couple of more critical interventions. One was related to the recommendation of competencies, and in particular, when students are trying to explore some of the tasks, specific tasks, and also with respect to the development of the plans, then the recommendations of the learning pathways or recommendations of different types of resources was also found to be essential. So we then embarked onto the design of ProSolo, and in that process, we from day one involved end users who designed ProSolo rather than software engineers or even some of us learning scientists who were trying to work on ProSolo. So as you can see, this is the landing page for ProSolo, and it is designed to look more or less similar to any social media software. And basically, you can easily recognize that ProSolo has opportunities for learners to have relationships similarly available on Twitter to follow each other. But then at the same time, we also recognize that many learners may not be known to each other. And then we actually had a feature that would recommend participants to connect with each other. And then we would basically compare them based on the similarity of their profiles, on the recency of their activity, or also unicity of their geographic location they are originally from, of course, provided they decided to disclose that information. The other critical set of components was for ProSolo that it would offer a set of reminders to learners when they are going through this process. And the other critical thing was also to offer learners different types of featured news. Especially we wanted to have these featured news that would be both collected by a set of agents and crawlers that we had implemented in ProSolo that are collecting information relevant and related to learners' personal interests, but at the same time also when some individual learners would like, for example, to set a new learning goal and share and invite to other individuals, and then that would also be populated into some of these featured news. And in that way, we would be scaffolding additionally some cooperative learning opportunities. Learners also inside of ProSolo, as I also mentioned, can integrate some of their social networking profiles. The moment they integrate, for example, Twitter, that Twitter basically is directly then poured into this activity stream that was available in the previous page. In addition to that, ProSolo allows for integrating and aggregating information that is of interest to learners through the use of different types of RSS feeds. So whether they are talking and maintaining their personal blogs, they are following other people's blogs, or they are following some relevant news or websites, they can actually get some of these RSS feeds. And how we do that, this is something that we picked up from the idea of Stephen Downes and George Siemens, which was implemented in early CMOOCs. And that is basically to allow learners to eventually get daily digests that are coming directly related to their own personal feeds, or something that is defined as a feed by the instructor or also by other learners inside of the course. And then learners have easy opportunities then to add or create basically, or add some of these activities into the documentation of their working plans towards achieving some of the competencies. Now we are moving towards this process that I explained for ProSolo, that ProSolo in nature supports planning, learning, and then presentation of their learning. So the initial step for planning how we also organizing inside of the DLA MOOC, that was the massive open online course that Ryan Baker, George Siemens, and Caroline Rose, including myself, taught in late 2014. And in that course, we basically also used ProSolo. So we basically structured ProSolo around credentials or small mini courses that would typically be composed of 2 or 3 competencies that learners would follow. So learners initially would, in their planning phase, be going through the available competencies and packaged inside of credentials, and then choosing which of these they would like to potentially enroll. Of course, once they are enrolled in some of these credentials, then they could set up a small group of learners, or they can move and just focus on specific types of competencies that are related to each of these credentials or mini courses that they decided to enroll and follow. In addition to that, each of these competencies that we said could be additionally personalized. What we meant by that is that learners were allowed to create new competencies because we didn't envision them in the design of ProSolo. They could also discover some of the existing competencies that were available there, or potentially we would also recommend them, and it was like a recommender engine behind ProSolo that was fully done based on the content filtering and by trying to match the previous activities of learners and some of the existing activities of learners with some other relevant activities or relevant competencies that they could have. And now for each of these competencies, we would have a specific activity plan, and learners would then not only be able to follow what instructors suggested to them, but also they would be able to add even their own activities inside of ProSolo. Once they completed all the activities, learners would then be requested to do the final thing, and that was basically to get and to ask for assessment. So assessment typically would be then reflected in the presentation of some of their credentials and some of their competencies in their public profiles, but more importantly, in the process of the assessment, that assessment inside of ProSolo can be organized in different types of models. ProSolo can support peer assessment, ProSolo can support expert assessment, or instructor assessment, where students really are not choosing the individual who is assessing their work, but rather the institution or the organization that is providing the educational opportunities is simply allocating some of these assessors that are then vetting whether and to what extent students had some of these competencies achieved. And part of that vetting process is also to have plenty of the comments that learners may get. And in addition to that, we also, and ProSolo supports a palette of different types of badges that learners may be assigned to, but also different organizations or different universities or even different courses may invent their own badges, and those could be incorporated into ProSolo. So this was the version of ProSolo that we had about the end of 2014. And what are some of the lessons that we learned in the execution of DLA MOOC, and some also recent development in the ideas and critical things that we are working on? First and most critical point that I want to make is that the lessons are at individual level of learners, but also some other lessons are more systemic ones. And systemic, when I say systemic, I mean about entire universities or the entire educational ecosystem that is affected potentially with this type of different model of educational learning. When we were looking at some more specific results in terms of the use of ProSolo, ProSolo was completely optional inside of the DLA MOOC. And the other critical thing which put the entire power structure, I would say, on the end of edX was that learners eventually, if they wanted to get the certificates, they were requested to submit their activities through edX, right? And therefore, that basically gave completely the edge to the use of edX if students wanted to get their certificates of completion from edX. But as you can see, the general and overall trends inside of ProSolo were fairly similar in terms of the decline curve and a kind of a long tail that we can also see commonly available inside of MOOCs. Many learners just logged in and checked in the beginning of the course, and then as the time was passing, many of them were kind of giving up, but then there was a kind of a big core of learners who decided to stick with ProSolo and who were using it continuously, and a similar matter that can also be compared to edX. However, we also wanted to probe different types of questions. Out of all possible learners who enroll into ProSolo and edX, how many of them in total numbers just basically continued learning inside of ProSolo? And we can also see that it was a bit or considerably bigger decline of learners in terms of those that were basically enrolled into the course and then continued to stay in the course in the future weeks. However, when we are comparing edX and ProSolo in terms of if a learner completed a week in ProSolo, what was the probability for that learner to stay in ProSolo or edX in the next week? And we can see that the numbers, although they are still giving a slight edge to edX, they were fairly on par. And even, I would say, towards the end, they, especially weeks 8 and 9, ProSolo and edX were kind of quite on par in that, and they were slight, even weeks in which ProSolo had a slight edge. But then this is really something that is reflective completely on the power structure and the whole design of the course, where students had to submit their final evidence about the completion of competencies or assignments through edX. And you can see there's a really steep decline in ProSolo because eventually the learners, even they were using ProSolo, they were mainly using it as an exploration or create some of their evidence, but eventually completion of these assignments was tagged primarily in edX simply because there was a requirement for them to get the credential. The other critical thing that we wanted to explore inside of ProSolo was which of these different types of interventions that we had in our interface influence different types of phases of self-regulated learning. Based on that, and similar as we did in our previous studies, was we extracted so-called transition graphs by simply basically knowing that certain sequences of clicks inside of ProSolo would be our hypothesized phases of self-regulated learning, and also different types of interventions. So for example, one of these reflections was status wall that was available on the main page, but also status wall which was available on the goals of students or their credentials. And also, of course, different types of suggestions for people. We can see again here that out of all these different interventions that we had, status wall and sharing activities with others was by far the strongest and most central intervention that we had. And we also could see that suggestion of other people who to work with was also quite central, which is also quite nicely aligned with the goals and aims of ProSolo. However, we can also see that learners and these interventions really didn't support so much reflection and evaluation inside of ProSolo. They supported to some extent. However, the critical thing, I believe in this case, is the context in which ProSolo was used, and that is that learners really primarily use ProSolo to explore opportunities and to get familiar with this new type of, or this new approach to learning. However, the platform itself and the overall course design really didn't guide students towards final completion and evaluation or assessment of some of their learning products, and thus the products of learning. And the other critical thing that we learned inside of ProSolo was that there is some time for some there's a time needed for learners to adjust to this new approach to learning. Typically, learners are typically offered by very structured courses and very streamlined process how to learn. However, if we are talking about competency-based learning, and also as we are talking about personalized learning, then the ownership of learning needs to be increased. And therefore, while we also experience a lot of comments that are related to the expressions of external locus of control, at the same time, we also acknowledge that basically transition and shift with some learners especially changed over time inside of the course. The other critical thing for ProSolo is basically, and I would say for general education, is to support learners in the development of their metacognitive skills. And we know from educational psychology as well that learners don't have a high level of metacognitive skills, and in particular, we human use generally ineffective study strategies. And there's a really good review done by Bjork, Danlowski, and Cornell, reviewing basically some of these typical illusions that we may have about our learning and also the ineffectiveness of some of the approaches to learning. So I strongly recommend having a look at that. However, existing research also in education psychology and self-regulated learning also recognizes the importance of so-called externally facilitated regulated learning and scaffolding, where learners are provided typically with standards or some nudges that are driving them in the right direction, and then these scaffolds are over time removed while learners are actually adopting a new approach to learning and then trying to better monitor the activities that they are taking and also sustaining some of these activities in a more effective manner. So in that process, what we decided to do, and this is our ongoing work, is to completely redesign this whole page for ProSolo that is talking about learning, where the whole process for learners, at least in the earliest phases, is completely streamlined. So they have a very clear idea that this is a credential, this is a competency in a particular credential, and then this is our activities that they need to complete. Also, in terms of the individuals they can collaborate with, they can easily find them, they can also follow them and potentially then compare their own progression with the progression of some of their peers, but also with respect to the activities and the pathways that their peers taken, of course, provided their peers decided to approve and share their activities with others. And of course, they can also follow some of their feeds in terms of the activities that are completing and also get potential ideas. And we also already saw that this is one of the most critical anyways, activities and interventions in terms of the technological scaffolding that we identified inside of ProSolo. And of course, ProSolo would allow learners to go through different types of activities, but then something which is already also shown to be potentially relevant scaffolding strategies if some activities are to be completed only upon the completion of some previous activities, then some of these activities may be disabled, and then the learners will be completely scaffolded on a particular direction before they are actually wondering what next to do. So this is another critical thing that we are working on. And then each of these competencies may actually be designed around different models. Some of them will be completely scaffolded, where learners will be requested to basically just follow the structure that the instructor provided them with, and other will be allowing for the complete freedom. And of course, learners in this process can also get some additional recommended activities to complete or add their own activities. The other space where we are extensively working on the development now, and we already have some work completed, is with respect to machine learning and text mining for improving teaching scaffolds. So, and this is really to better inform instructional design, because instructional design has been found in the literature as the most active ingredient for any successful learning. And therefore, in that process, what we are then trying to do is to empower instructors, especially as we are talking about competency model where learners are doing their own activities, about ways how instructors can track the progression of some of their learners. And as you can see, I mean, we are trying to use the similar metaphor for presentation of the progression of learners as we are using for learners to actually just even progress themselves through this type of representation of their pathways. And so the instructors can see this level of progression, and they can also see the level of progression, the level of credentials, the level of competencies, but then also at the level of activities. And for each activity, they can also get a feedback with respect to how much time students are spending on more complex activities compared to how much time they spend on activities that are actually not really that complex. And if they are really spending a lot of time on activities that are nearly not that complex or deemed to be difficult, then obviously students are struggling with some of these activities, and we should be working on how to address them. Provided, of course, this time measurement is something that we've been working also in terms of detection of outliers and improve the accuracy of the measurement, how students are actually spending time, on task, and online. And this is something that we also had a really, not so really intentional experiment inside of ProSolo. Initially, ProSolo was designed in such a way that automatic sign out would be after 15 minutes of inactivity. And then during the DLA MOOC, learners started actually complaining this was really not good enough for them, and they were signed out even though they were in the midst of completing some activities and so on. And so we basically then extended it to 1 hour. However, we, in this way, completely acquired a goal, in a way, gold standard for estimation how much actually time students are spending compared to how much time students are doing something irrelevant and what would be the potential outlier. And that significantly then increased the opportunities for us for accuracy of the activities. The other thing is what we are offering in addition to some of these content-related and pathway analytics is also some timelines and temporal activities that we can see how learners are doing with respect to some of the critical milestones in the course and whether students are addressing these critical milestones. And then from this perspective also, it's really critical to determine for instructors what are those critical things, or we call them, for the lack of better terminology at the moment, symptoms that learners are potentially struggling with, that they are not really communicating enough with their peers and so on, and then also what type of suggestions or interventions were conducted for learners. Our intention with this is that instructors would be choosing this out of the list of potentially predefined symptoms inside of their institution, and then also out of the list of best practices about different types of interventions. And then the idea is, as the time is progressing and we are accumulating some of these interventions, that we will be also machine learning some of these symptoms or suggestions and interventions. And then rather than providing instructors with some of these measures, we will be also accompanying them with possible reasons that are more aligned with the pedagogical rationale, what students are struggling with and what potentially can be done, so that instructors can be also offered with these more instructionally relevant interventions, rather they need to also just go through the data and think about how to interpret some of these data. Of course, this type of format requires different type of interaction of instructors with students. And how does this interaction changes? Because it's much less formal, and also it's more fluid, and it's also happening at different times, rather than doing that in a kind of a discussion board, or doing that inside of a particular email software. The other thing that is really critical, and what we are seeing as a big opportunity, is that we are seeing a big need for credentialing, and there are some organizations in the world that are actually completely being set up to start thinking about different types of credentialing procedures. They don't care where learning happens. They care whether you have and can you produce evidence that you have certain learning. And this is basically the opportunity where different alliances between credentialing organizations and higher ed institutions may happen, where they can work potentially on the collection and compilation of some of these profiles for learners, or different types of models, how assessment for credentialing can happen. Great example is Deakin Digital, an organization out of Melbourne in Australia, which is trying to come up with a model for that. The other critical thing is, of course, for many institutions that are willing to adopt this model, is to think about the policy. What are the necessary policies to set up new competency-based programs? There are some examples already available there, but it requires really a lot of institutional thinking, and also requires kind of institutional restructure, and also of educational resources to structure them around competencies, and also to develop pedagogical models that are supporting learners in that process. And then, of course, the critical other thing is, in terms of, if you are talking about the importance of competencies, is to create content frameworks and competency frameworks that are relevant for specific disciplines. There are some disciplines that are really far advanced in definition of their competencies and documenting those, and even having standards, such as, for example, nursing. However, some other areas may not be so much supported with this. And the question becomes how we actually get to that point of supporting different disciplines. Obviously, this is a really kind of a big emerging area, and technology plays only a single part in it. We think that ProSolo has some promise, plenty of things to be done, not only on the technological end, but also on the policy and the overall organizational change end. Anyways, thanks very much for your attention, and look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Dragan. So this was very enlightening. So I know ProSolo for quite a while, but it was very interesting to see how you worked on overcoming the problems that ProSolo initially had. And I think the paths that you described are very promising. And I think I have more questions than we can actually address in the remaining time. But let me start with something that relates to what you just said, frameworks that are required in the future. Do you already have an idea what kind of frameworks you would like to build on in ProSolo? So of course, there's a lot that has yet to be developed, but there are already frameworks out there. We recently had a talk by Pierre Dillenburg, orchestration graphs. How does something like the orchestration graph approach that Pierre introduced recently connect with your goals in ProSolo, which is a more flexible and a more open way of learning, while the orchestration graphs are a more structured way of learning, but with the potential of allowing people to do a self-paced or self-structured learning as well. So is there a connection between these two different approaches, these two different ideas?
No, thanks very much. That's a really great question. In the core idea of ProSolo really is that there will be strong instructional designs, right? And these designs can be offered as initial scaffolds to some of the competencies that learners may be following. And those as well may be quite needed for many learners, right? Especially in early days when they are adjusting to this new model of learning and until they are developing some of their self-directed learning skills. And as I already said, instructional design is so essential and scaffolding is so essential. And therefore, approaches such as orchestration graphs that Pierre Dillenburg is suggesting, which is quite similar to the notion that is already available, for example, in business process modeling and business process models, right? And workflow models, right? Is quite neat and it's quite relevant. And what we are trying to do, and I mean, I also showed some of these analysis that we are conducting. We are using really transition graphs, and we are accumulating some of these transition graphs, and we would like to see to what extent then we can measure the level of alignment of some of these orchestration graphs that are providing the specifications how learning can happen, and then what actually happens, and especially if that happens in open spaces. So the field of, for example, process mining offers plenty of opportunities to measure that level of alignment between existing processes and the traces that are reflecting the actual execution of the workflow of process software information systems, how they call that in that field. So in this particular case, similar approach can actually be done, and I don't see it really that disconnected, except of course would be quite useful for especially instructors to have certain type of libraries that are already offering some of these effective instructional designs so that they don't really have to think much and also develop that kind of expertise, because if you're talking about specific instructors, they're not necessarily the instructional design experts, but at the same time, then some of these tools can help them in their process. So this is my take on it.
Hey, thank you. We just got a question from Daniel Hickey, and he asked if you could say more about the badges. Did you put some of the evidence from engagement in ProSolo in the evidence field in the badges?
No, that's a great question. This is something I would say highly underexplored part of ProSolo. We only have existing infrastructure. Inside of the DLA MOOC, we have not really promoted heavily the use of badges. And also from the perspective of the implementation of badges, we really haven't thought much about the ways how badges can be used as the evidence. We only at this moment have just the technological infrastructure that can support it, but we ourselves haven't experimented much with it, and would be really very keen to work with people who would like to experiment with ProSolo and to work with badges.
I have maybe a follow-up question on that, if you have an idea regarding something similar as badges. So you did analysis for research purposes, how learning happened, what kind of learners there are. But ProSolo is also supposed to aggregate learner information, both for the learners, but also for the instructors. Have you, do you have an idea what you can communicate to learners and what you can communicate to instructors so they can actually take something away from this information? How can you translate the information that you get from ProSolo into something that the learner and the instructor can actually use to improve the course, the instruction, and the learning behavior?
No, thanks very much. I mean, that's a great question, very important question.
Badges are one way of, so if you assign a badge, you basically tell someone they have mastered something, or they have a certain competence.
That's right. So at the moment, from the perspective of learners, and to show basically that they may have certain competency, instructors can give them recognition. That can be also a narrative. So they can also get a kind of as a reference letter as well. And also they can get a signed badge as well by the person who is giving a badge to them. So I can see ProSolo being used in different types of models. One of them is, of course, where you have more formal authorities, such as the course instructors who assign some of these badges, but you can also think in terms of communities, where ProSolo also can support different types of roles, and then inside of these communities, different individuals, as they are growing, they can also have access to assigning different types of badges, and that community then itself can take and work on this process. Also, in terms of ProSolo, as the information that is being measured, and it's part of our ongoing efforts with respect to analytics, is something that is very significant. The design that we currently have inside of ProSolo is quite inspired, actually, with lots of things that we learned in another Australian project funded by the Australian government's Office for Learning and Teaching, in which we are developing a conceptual framework as well as another tool for empowering instructors in higher education with different types of analytics. And this is really one stepping stone, I'm thinking about that, and different types of analytics that we identify by basically talking to a number of instructors and soliciting some of their needs. But at the same time, we are also realizing that many of these analytics that we are currently providing are very technical. And I'm just wondering why instructors need to see even any charts. Right. Why don't they need just to see a simple checklist of the critical things, right, that are most relevant to focus on and pay attention to? And to me, that's probably one of the major directions that we see ProSolo to be going into. And that's why I said basically that we are seeing at this stage instructors documenting some of these critical problems students are struggling with. And then over time, hopefully we will be able then to have machine learning algorithms that will learn to identify some of these potential issues that are human interpretable, predicted. And then based on that, instructors will be provided with these possible issues that students are struggling with, rather than to basically ask them to just think about these charts, etc. So that's the other critical component that we are thinking for instructors, and likewise for students as well. So one thing is showing students data, but then we are still to see evidence whether that is really effective for learners. And the other thing is basically, if we are talking about very natural and the things that are proven in education, providing simple narrative feedback to students what to do next is something that we should be aiming at, and I think that's the direction that ProSolo is taking.
Okay, thank you. I have yet another follow-up questions that goes into this direction. So one thing is giving feedback about the learning, about where someone stands in their learning process, assigning roles, giving feedback what someone mastered and what their learning style is, and giving feedback to instructors. But is there a way to facilitate better social learning in a way that the right people find each other? So people might take the feedback and turn it into something beneficial for their learning. But can they also interpret the feedback in terms of who they should learn with? Does the feedback give learners the opportunity to form better learning groups or better social learning? So the question is, do people look for similar people who are like them, learners who are like them? And is that the best way of forming a learning group, or should they be looking for someone who has complementary skills or knowledge? So basically people who are not like them. So how does ProSolo, or what is the opportunity for ProSolo to intervene in the social learning group formation?
That's a great question. Also very hard problem, right? So group composition, and there are many approaches. And the question really becomes how you compose groups and what type of criteria. I mean, what do we know from group effectiveness? It's really critical. I mean, there is some literature in terms of trying to measure, for example, group intelligence. And I think that's also talks a lot about what it means to be an effective group and strong group in solving problems. One basically thing is to have more women in your groups. That's basically what the research showed. But in a way, it was kind of a proxy for higher level of social skills, right? And better communication skills for group members. So this is really one critical thing that we need to think about, how we are helping our students to develop their communication skills if we want to have effective group work. The other critical component here is basically how we nudge learners towards groups that are offering equitable participation opportunities. So it's not just basically to find people, right people to do, but rather also to find groups that are actually having more equitable distribution of their participation in the discussions and conversations, so that they are actually showing a real group spirit. That's the other critical thing. So those are from one angle. The other angle is, of course, and research also shows in social network analysis that friendship networks are good in terms of providing social structures, but they are not good in predicting students' performance, right? So you may have one maybe friend and or two friends that you are actually working with, but you need to also have other people, and typically friendship networks are not associated at all, no significant association with the outcomes, while, for example, even those networks that are actually your kind of opponents are positively associated with your learning, which indicates really the importance of being exposed to different opinions and different people. And of course, always with somebody new, that because it allows you to establish new social network and expand your social networks. So I'm thinking from this perspective, and also if you're thinking about that in terms of computational algorithms, it's a really hard NP problem, right? Because it's a multi-criteria problem that needs to be optimized, and then the question is which of these criteria you are actually addressing to be optimized so that you can address. And I think in certain aspects you need to also understand the community and the culture of these people, and then you may not need to have a very effective algorithm, but simply just understand the culture and then assign some of these groups by knowing who they are.
Yeah, so community and culture is a good keyword for maybe my last question, since we're approaching the end of the hour. So on the one hand, ProSolo aims to foster credentialing, so institutionalized learning in a way so that people can get credentials from institutions, and institutions are able to give out credentials. But on the other hand, ProSolo also fosters some kind of a less institutionalized learning. So a self-paced learning, lifelong learning in a way. So what do you see as the opportunities for ProSolo to build more persistent and sustainable communities around learning topics or topics of interest rather than single courses? Or maybe not that far away from where we are, cross-course communities. So if you have a set of courses that belong to the same topic area, can you build and create communities around these several courses rather than building a community around a single course that is tied to one very structured instructional design? So more open communities in a way.
Thanks, Oliver. I think you really identify one of the critical components of ProSolo, and that is that we wanted to break that nature of courses, and the students basically established some of their links and networks or communities within courses, and once those courses are finished, then those online networks disappear, right? And there is no good technological support for them to continue with some of these networks. There are, of course, some existing technologies that are out there that are supporting some of that. For example, Athabasca University has something which is called Landing. The Landing basically is based on ELG, which is a social networking software, ELGG, used also by several other institutions to support some of these communities. But of course, I mean, it has to be nurtured. It has to be accepted by several other individuals and other courses so that you actually develop that sustainable community. ProSolo by its own nature really has communities and individuals as the first-class citizens, and then competencies are coming as the second level instances, right? And therefore, for any course, you are actually having all these social networks that are already prerequisites and surrounding anything that is related to content or your learning activities. And therefore, the moment you are jumping into new course, you are already having your entire network or your entire community, which is formed around it. And to me, then that means that, of course, you can build that around certain topics and in the end of the day, people who share similar interests will be also part of the similar networks. But at the same time, ProSolo allows them to have some of these shared interests which go beyond just some of these courses or individual courses that are available for them to study.
Mm-hmm. In a way, I think a lot of what we would need is already there. It's a matter of how the integration of ProSolo or a network like that is framed. So is ProSolo an additional layer on top or besides of a MOOC, or is ProSolo the social layer of a whole MOOC platform, for example? So that would make a big difference. So if I take edX, for example, it's a big infrastructure and platform of many courses. So if ProSolo was a platform on the edX level, basically on the institutional level, then it would foster the communication across courses more than if you have a course that uses ProSolo as a learning infrastructure and learning platform. So from what I see, ProSolo offers a lot of what is needed, but it needs to be framed in a way that that facilitates and fosters these ways of interaction and learning.
Yeah, no, that's a good point, Oliver. Thanks very much. It can be framed both ways, as the social layer, but also as even simple LMS, right? Which is very socially intensive, right?
Okay. So I think we're out of time now. I would have many more questions, but I think we should stop at this point. And I want to thank you again for being here today and giving this very interesting talk. And if anyone watches the recording of this video, you can, of course, post questions to the DANS Google group if you have follow-up questions, and also address questions to Dragan and us. Thanks again, Dragan, and see you at the next DANS talk in March.
Thanks very much, Oliver.